Thank you all for being here on this beautiful Saturday evening for what promises to be an incredibly rich and productive discussion. We're going to be talking about how we think really about history. Um, I don't think it would be overstating the point to say that most of us are taught a history of the land. We are taught to think of civilization, of cities, as originating deep in river valleys. But Professor Menon, in two absolutely fascinating volumes, has made the case that we're looking at history entirely wrong. Instead of looking at history as a process that emerges upriver and then moves down to the coast, it's actually the other way around. As you said, Dilip, if you look at the migration of humanity, as we're moving out of Africa, we cling to the coast. As we are moving along the coast, we're eating shellfish, we're fishing, we are settling down and moving further and further. We're spreading into archipelagos. And as we're moving, we are constantly trading with each other. This is a history of 40,000 years of global exchange. And against the vastness of this huge stretch of time, urban civilizations in river valleys, which are barely 5,000-year old, seem like little more than a blip. So to begin with, Dilip, let's first understand what do we mean when we say ocean as method. What method are we referring to?
Thank you so much, Anirudh. I'm a great admirer of his work, so it's a pleasure for me to be interviewed by Anirudh. I've read his first book, and I shall be reading the second book as soon as it's available. The reason why I thought about the phrase ocean as method is that at one level it's very clear that the ocean exists on the fringes of our consciousness, so that when you live in Kerala, the ocean is just beside us. But it's also beside our heads in the sense that an entire historiography is modeled on temples, on land relations, peasant struggles, and so on. And there's very little cognizance that's taken of the sea, even though a large number of Malayalis from time immemorial have been moving across the sea. The Roman Empire has traded with Kerala from the first millennium, and so on and so forth. So this required something more than just an empirical argument, because empirically this is true, right? But the question arises then as to why we do not engage with the sea at all. And here there's a larger question that emerges, which is conceptual and historiographical. So when the East India Company arrives on the coast of India in the 18th century, conquers and embarks on its wars of conquest, and then subsequently institutes a land settlement. So when you go to school, you go to university, you study the permanent settlement, the Rayatwari settlement, the Bhayachara settlement. The idea is to root people in the land, create a hierarchy on the land where there is a landowner or a set of people who control the land, who will ensure law and order, provide revenue to the state, provide military fodder to the state. And as a result, the imagination of the space that we occupy comes to be governed by the imagination of the elite. Because the elite are landed. That's where their power lies, that's where their genealogy lies. What gets confined to the margins is the histories of fisher people, the histories of merchants. It's very surprising, isn't it? I mean, even looking at your own work, that if you think across Asia and Europe, if you think about the orders of society, the merchant is always somewhere towards the bottom, right? Whereas without mercantile wealth, it is not possible to establish monarchies. It is not possible to keep an economy going. And despite the fact that mercantile wealth undergirds the formation of states, and mercantile wealth is usually made in the passage across the ocean, it remains subordinated. So this demands that we think about ocean as method in order to understand why is it that we can't see what is in front of our eyes, and why is it that we refuse to get our feet wet, right? And in fact, one could say that the whole enterprise of history writing in modern India has been an enterprise of a history that refuses to get its feet west. So think about the classic text of nationalism, Nehru's Discovery of India. And I'll stop with this example. So you have the invention of a history that stretches all the way from the Indus Valley civilization, right? So India is conceived as existing from the northwest to the south, to Kanyakumari. You ask anybody what is the extent of India, Kashmir to Kanyakumari and Nagaland to Gujarat, and somehow we don't just step over into the water. So this demands a conceptual engagement rather than a merely empirical engagement. It's very evident that the sea matters, but we have to ask ourselves, why doesn't the sea matter for our history writing?
I think that we've ended in this. We're actually sitting in a metaphor for the way that we see the ocean. In this beautiful air-conditioned hall, our backs are to the ocean and we are closed off from it. And here we are talking about it. I want to talk a little bit about this extraordinary ability of the ocean to connect geographies, which I think is one of the most important results of thinking from the ocean. Are any of you familiar with this textile called the original or real Madras handkerchief? So it's used to be a fairly famous textile that was exported from Chennai all over the British Raj, but seems to be much older than the British Raj itself. Now, very often when we think of traditional clothing, we think of indigenous clothing, right? In India, for example, if I were to ask you what is a traditional costume, we are thinking about cloths, textiles, fashions that developed in India. Now, here's the crazy thing. On the west coast of Africa, in the present day state of Nigeria, there is a culture called the Igbo, and the Igbo's traditional attire is the Madras textile. Sorry? Yes. It's called Injari, which means Indian textile. And this, I think, really challenges the way that we think about indigenous, domestic, traditional, which place is connected to what. Because just as you have an an African tribe wearing an Indian textile, similarly, so many of the dishes that we think of as traditionally Indian, think of kappa, for example, here in Kerala, or think about aloo and tomato in North India, these are not vegetables that come from India. These are vegetables that come from South America. But as Dilip said, just as we imagine India with this bit of a conceptual hop from coast to coast without talking about what's actually connecting the coast, we similarly are aware in principle that yes, we are eating South American vegetables, but we never think of how did this connection come to be? How is it that we are literally talking about an exchange between the Pacific and the Indian Ocean? And the ocean is not just this undifferentiated entity. It is a coastline. It is many cultures. It is many languages. With this in mind, I'd like to come back to the Indian coast. I'd like to talk about one of the most fascinating of all medieval travelers, the Moroccan jurist Ibn Battuta. Now, Dilip, could you tell us a little bit about this man's travels? How far did he get? And what was it about the cultural or cosmopolitan arrangements along the coast that enabled him to travel as far as he did?
Right. I mean, if you look at the travels to Malabar, right? I mean, and I always begin with this wonderful phrase from the Malayali literary critic Kesari Balakrishna, who in 1935 in the Madhrubhumi began writing a series of articles on the history of Kerala. And he begins with Babylon, right? And which was never a part of Kerala. So the reason why he begins with Babylon is he's thinking about the millennium-long engagement with the Roman Empire, so that when the Roman Empire fought wars with Carthage and Carthage was defeated, it had to pay tribute in pepper. The pepper came from Kerala. So this leads Kesari Balakrishna to begin his history then, 1,000 years ago, and not in Parashurama flinging his axe, but in this actual material transactions happening across the sea. So he asked that question, is Kerala a part of the history of Rome, or is Rome a part of the history of Kerala? right? Our conventional historiography makes all of us chapters in the history of Western imperialism. So he's actually rebelling against that.